"Undress me now or I'll do it myself," ordered the lonesome widow to the rancher Martha Henley, stepped off the Greyhound bus onto the dusty main street of Casper, Wyoming, on a scorching afternoon in July 1952. The heat hit her like a wall, so different from the humid summers she'd known back in Ohio. She clutched her worn, brown suitcase tighter, feeling the weight of everything she owned pressing against her tired arm. At 47 years old, Martha never imagined she'd be starting over in a place where she knew absolutely no one, but life had a way of pushing people into corners they never expected to find themselves in. Her husband Thomas had died 6 months earlier, leaving behind nothing but memories and a mountain of gambling debts that Martha hadn't even known existed. The bank had taken their house, the furniture, everything. Her grown son lived in California with his own family and barely had enough to support his wife and 3 children. Martha refused to be a burden. By axes, she'd always been independent, always found her own way. So when she saw the advertisement in the newspaper for a housekeeper position on a remote Wyoming ranch, she'd written immediately. The pay wasn't much, but it included room and board, and that was more than she had now. A dusty pickup truck pulled up beside her, and a weathered man with gray hair peeking out from under his hat leaned out the window. "You, Mrs. Henley?" he asked, his voice rough from years of outdoor work. "That's me," Martha replied, squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin. She wouldn't let anyone see how scared she really was. "Name's Pete. Mr. Rutledge sent me to fetch you. It's about an hour's drive to the ranch." The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction as they drove. Rolling hills covered in brown grass, the occasional cluster of cattle, and sky that seemed to go on forever. Martha had never seen so much open space in her life. It made her feel small and insignificant, but also strangely free. Out here, nobody knew about Thomas's debts or the whispered gossip of her old neighbors. She could be anyone she wanted to be. The Double R Ranch appeared on the horizon like something out of a Western movie. The main house was a sprawling 2-story structure that had once been white, but now looked more gray from dust and neglect. Several barns and outbuildings dotted the property, and Martha could see horses in a distant corral. Pete pulled up to the front porch, where a tall man stood waiting. James Rutledge was 52 years old, though the sun and hard work had carved lines into his face that made him look older. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching Martha approach with a guarded expression. His clothes were clean but wrinkled, his hair needed cutting, and Martha noticed immediately that he had the look of a man who'd forgotten how to take care of himself. "Mrs. Henley," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but brief. "Welcome to Double R. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "I've had worse days," Martha replied honestly. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Rutledge. Just James is fine. Come on, I'll show you to your room, then give you a tour of the house." Martha followed him inside and immediately understood why he'd been so desperate for a housekeeper. The entry hall was covered in a thick layer of dust. Through the doorway to the left, she could see a living room where newspapers and ranch catalogs were piled on every surface. The kitchen, when they reached it, made her gasp. Dishes were stacked so high in the sink that some had toppled over. The floor was sticky, the counters cluttered with empty cans and boxes. The whole place smelled stale and forgotten. James had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know it's bad. My wife Elizabeth, she passed 3 years ago. Cancer. I've tried to keep up with things, but running the ranch alone doesn't leave much time for housekeeping." Martha set down her suitcase with a thud. "Well, you hired the right person. I'll have this place looking proper within a week." She rolled up her sleeves right then and there. "But first, show me where things are kept. I'll need cleaning supplies and lots of them." Over the next few days, Martha worked like a woman possessed. She started in the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. She washed what seemed like hundreds of dishes, organized the pantry, and threw out food that had expired months or even years ago. James watched her with something like amazement, staying out of her way, but occasionally appearing to ask if she needed anything. "You don't have to do everything in one day," he said on the 3rd morning, finding her on her hands and knees scrubbing the hallway floor. "I can't rest knowing there's work to be done," Martha replied without looking up. "My mother always said idle hands make for a troubled mind, and I've got enough troubles without adding idleness to the list." James studied her for a moment. "You running from something, Mrs. Henley?" Martha sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of gray-streaked brown hair out of her face. "Aren't we all running from something, Mr. Peterson? Rutledge? The question is whether we're running towards something better." He nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "Fair enough. I'll leave you to it." By the end of the first week, the downstairs of the house was transformed. Martha had cleaned, organized, and brought life back into rooms that had been dark and neglected for too long. She'd also started cooking proper meals, insisting that James sit down at the table for breakfast and dinner instead of eating cold beans straight from the can while standing at the counter. "I can't remember the last time I had pot roast this good," James said one evening, actually smiling for the first time since she'd arrived. "Elizabeth used to make it on Sundays." "It's nothing special, just basic cooking," Martha said, though she was pleased. "A man can't run a ranch on an empty stomach or spoiled food." James's smile faded slightly. "You remind me a bit of her. Elizabeth, I mean. She never let me get away with anything either, always pushing me to be better." Martha felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry for your loss. It must be hard living here with all the memories." "Some days are harder than others," James admitted, "but keeping busy helps. The ranch doesn't care about my grief. The cattle need feeding, the fences need mending, life goes on whether I'm ready or not." "I understand that," Martha said quietly. After Thomas died, people kept telling me time would heal everything, but time doesn't heal anything if you just sit still and let it pass. You have to keep moving, keep doing, keep finding reasons to get up in the morning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who understood loss in ways that others couldn't. The ranch hands who worked for James would come in for meals occasionally, and Martha noticed how they perked up when they saw the clean house and smelled real cooking. They were polite to her, calling her ma'am and thanking her for the food, but she also caught them exchanging meaningful glances when they thought she wasn't looking. One of the younger hands, a boy named Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 19, lingered after dinner one night to help Martha with the dishes. "It's real nice what you're doing here, ma'am," he said shyly. "The bossie's been like a ghost since Mrs. Rutledge passed. Barely talked, barely ate, but since you came, he's different. More like his old self." Martha dried a plate thoughtfully. People need purpose and routine. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them of that. As summer deepened into August, a pattern emerged. Martha would rise before dawn to start breakfast. James would come in from checking the early morning fences, and they'd eat together while discussing the day ahead. She'd spend her days cleaning, cooking, and managing the household while he worked the ranch. In the evenings, they'd share dinner and sometimes sit on the porch afterward, watching the sun set over the endless Wyoming sky. Martha found herself actually enjoying the work and the solitude. Back in Ohio, she'd been surrounded by people who knew her business, who whispered about poor Martha, whose husband had gambled away everything. Here, she was simply the housekeeper, respected for her work and her no-nonsense attitude. She was building something new, something that was entirely hers. James, for his part, found himself looking forward to coming home in a way he hadn't since Elizabeth died. The house was warm and welcoming now, filled with the smells of cooking and the sight of curtains that had been washed and mended. More than that, Martha's presence filled a silence he hadn't realized was suffocating him. She wasn't Elizabeth, and he didn't want her to be, but she was someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. Neither of them spoke about the future or what their arrangement might become. They were two wounded people finding comfort in routine and companionship, nothing more. At least, that's what they told themselves as summer faded toward fall, and the first hints of autumn began coloring the distant mountains. As September arrived, the Wyoming landscape began its transformation. The endless brown grasses took on golden hues, and the air carried a crispness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Martha had now been at the Double R Ranch for 2 months, and the place had become something she never expected it would be: home. The house gleamed with care and attention. Every room had been scrubbed, every window washed until the glass sparkled in the sunlight. Martha had even tackled James's bedroom, which he'd been hesitant to let her enter at first. She'd found it exactly as his late wife had left it, her brush still on the dresser, her reading glasses on the nightstand beside a book with a bookmark still in place. "I couldn't bring myself to move anything," James had admitted, standing in the doorway while Martha gently dusted the furniture. It felt like erasing her somehow. Martha had paused, holding Elizabeth's silver brush carefully. "Keeping things exactly the same isn't honoring her memory, James. It's trying to freeze time, and time doesn't freeze. It just keeps moving whether we want it to or not." She looked at him with understanding in her eyes. She wouldn't want you living in a museum. Together, they'd carefully packed Elizabeth's personal belongings into boxes, which James stored in the attic. It had been painful but necessary, and afterward, James seemed lighter somehow, as if he'd been carrying a weight he could finally set down. The ranch work continued its endless cycle. Cattle needed moving to different pastures, fences required constant repair, and preparations for winter had to begin early this far north. James worked from dawn until dusk most days, and Martha noticed how he'd come in exhausted, his shoulders tight with tension and his hands rough from labor. One evening in late September, she'd prepared a particularly hearty beef stew, knowing he'd been out mending fences in the far pasture all day. When he came in, he looked more tired than usual, moving slowly as he washed up at the kitchen sink. "Long day?" Martha asked, ladling stew into bowls. "Found a section of fence completely down. Had to replace 20 posts." "My back is reminding me I'm not 30 anymore," James said with a rueful smile, lowering himself carefully into his chair. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of easy quiet that only comes between people who've grown accustomed to each other's presence. Martha had learned that James wasn't much for small talk, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. "You know," he said suddenly, "I've been thinking about hiring another hand for the winter. Tommy's good and Pete's reliable, but we could use an extra set of hands when the snow comes." Martha nodded, refilling his coffee cup. "That sounds wise. You can't do everything yourself, despite what you seem to think." James chuckled, a sound that had become more frequent as the weeks passed. "You've got a way of speaking your mind that most people don't appreciate, Martha, but I've come to value it." "Someone has to tell you the truth," she replied with a slight smile. "You're stubborn as a mule, and you work yourself too hard." "Takes one to know one," James countered. "I've seen you scrubbing floors until your hands are raw. You don't exactly take it easy yourself." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, something neither was quite ready to name. Martha looked away first, suddenly very interested in her stew. The incident that changed everything happened on a cool October evening. Martha had been canning tomatoes all day, putting up preserves for the winter months ahead. The kitchen was steamy and hot from the boiling water, and her feet ached from standing for hours. She'd just pulled the last batch of jars from the water bath when her foot slipped on a wet spot on the floor. She went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her as she fell. The pot of boiling water she'd been holding flew from her hands, and instinctively she twisted away from it, which only made her ankle wrench more painfully. The pot clattered to the floor, sending hot water across the kitchen tiles, but miraculously missing Martha entirely. James had been in the next room going over ranch accounts when he heard the crash. He was in the kitchen in seconds, finding Martha on the floor, her face pale with pain, clutching her ankle. "Don't move," he said, kneeling beside her. "Let me see." Martha's ankle was already swelling, and when James gently touched it, she couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. "I don't think it's broken," she managed to say through gritted teeth. "Just twisted badly." Without asking permission, James scooped her up in his arms. Despite his age, years of ranch work had kept him strong, and he carried her as easily as he might carry a bale of hay. Martha was too surprised and in too much pain to protest. He carried her through the house to her bedroom on the ground floor, laying her gently on the bed. "I'll get some ice and bandages," he said, his face creased with concern. "Don't try to stand on it." Over the next hour, James tended to her ankle with surprising gentleness. He wrapped it carefully in strips of cloth soaked in cold water, elevated it on pillows, and insisted she take aspirin for the pain. His hands, usually rough from work, were surprisingly gentle as they worked. "You're good at this," Martha said, watching him. "Did you learn from taking care of Elizabeth?" James nodded, his expression distant. "She was sick for a long time before the end. I learned how to be a nurse, whether I wanted to or not." He looked up at Martha. "But I never minded. She was my wife. Taking care of her was just what you do when you love someone." The word love hung in the air between them. Martha felt her heart beating faster, though whether from pain or something else, she couldn't quite say. James seemed to realize what he'd said and cleared his throat, standing up quickly. "You need to stay off that ankle for at least a week," he said, his voice gruff. "Doctor's orders, even if I'm not actually a doctor." "I can't stay in bed for a week," Martha protested. "Who's going to cook? Who's going to manage the house? I managed before you came, and I'll manage now," James said firmly. "Besides, the boys and I can handle simple cooking. We won't starve in a week." For the next several days, Martha was forced to rest while her ankle healed. James brought her meals on a tray, and in the evenings after the ranch work was done, he'd sit in the chair beside her bed and they'd talk, really talk in ways they hadn't before. James told her about his childhood on a farm in Montana, about meeting Elizabeth at a church social when they were both 19, about building the ranch from nothing over 30 years of hard work. He spoke about their 2 children, a daughter who lived in Denver with her husband and rarely visited, and a son in Portland who sent dutiful letters twice a year but seemed to have little interest in the ranch or his father's life. "They blamed me when Elizabeth died," James admitted one evening, staring at his hands. "Said I should have caught it sooner, should have made her see more doctors. They were probably right." "That's grief talking," Martha said gently. "People need someone to blame when something terrible happens, and children often blame their parents even when it's not fair." Martha in turn told James about Thomas. Not the sanitized version she'd given when she first arrived, but the truth. About how he'd been a good man for many years, but something had changed in him after he lost his job at the factory. How he'd started going to card games and horse races, always promising it would be just one more time. How she discovered the debts only after he died of a heart attack, leaving her with nothing but shame and bills she couldn't pay. I was angry at him for so long, she confessed. Angry that he'd left me in such a mess. Angry that he'd been so weak. Angry that I hadn't seen it happening sooner. But I've learned that anger doesn't change anything. It just eats you up from the inside. James reached over and took her hand, a gesture that surprised them both. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. You're a strong woman, Martha. Stronger than you probably realize. I don't feel strong most days, she admitted. I feel like I'm just barely keeping my head above water. That's what strength is, James said quietly. It's not never being afraid or never struggling. It's getting up every morning and doing what needs to be done even when you don't think you can. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, two middle-aged people who'd both lost so much finding comfort in each other's presence. When James finally stood to leave, letting go of her hand reluctantly, Martha felt the absence of his touch like a physical cold. By the time her ankle had healed enough for her to return to her duties, something fundamental had shifted between them. The glances they exchanged across the dinner table lasted a bit longer. When they passed each other in the hallway, they were acutely aware of the space between their bodies. The accidental brush of hands when he passed her the salt became charged with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. The ranch hands noticed the change. Pete, who'd worked for James for 15 years, mentioned it to Tommy one morning while they were feeding the horses. Boss is different lately, Pete observed. Happier, somehow. And have you noticed how he always makes sure to come in for lunch now? Even on days when we're working the far pastures? Tommy grinned. Mrs. Henley's got good cooking. Can't blame him. It's not just the cooking, boy, Pete said, shaking his head. Mark my words, something's brewing between those two. And about time, too. A man shouldn't be alone forever. Inside the house, Martha was wrestling with her own confusion. She found herself listening for James's footsteps, looking forward to their evening conversations, feeling a flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. It had been so long since she'd felt anything like this that she'd almost forgotten what it was like. But she was also terrified. What if she was reading too much into simple kindness? What if he still loved Elizabeth too much to ever feel anything for another woman? What if she opened her heart only to have it broken again? James was fighting his own battle with guilt and desire. Sometimes at night, lying in bed, he'd think about Martha's laugh, the way she hummed while she worked, the strength in her hands and the kindness in her eyes. Then he'd feel guilty, as if thinking about another woman was somehow betraying Elizabeth's memory. But Elizabeth had been gone for 3 years, and he was so tired of being lonely. October faded into November, and the first real cold arrived. James began preparing for winter in earnest, and Martha watched the sky with growing concern. She'd never experienced a Wyoming winter, and the old-timers in town, where she occasionally went for supplies, spoke of it with a mixture of respect and fear. You haven't seen cold until you've seen a Wyoming blizzard, the grocer had told her. Some years we get snowed in for weeks at a time. Make sure you've got plenty of supplies laid in. Martha took the advice seriously, filling the pantry and cellar with enough food to feed an army. She mended every blanket in the house, checked every window for drafts, and made sure there was plenty of firewood stacked near the house. Neither she nor James knew it then, but the winter ahead would test them in ways neither expected, forcing them to confront feelings they'd been carefully avoiding and making decisions that would change both their lives forever. The first major snowfall came in mid-November, dusting the ranch with several inches of white powder that transformed the landscape into something magical and strange. Martha stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes drift down in the early morning light, feeling both awed and apprehensive. She'd seen snow before, of course, but never like this, never with the knowledge that she was miles from town with winter truly settling in. James came in from the morning chores, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. This is just the beginning, he said, reading her expression. The real storms won't hit until December or January. This is just a preview. Martha turned from the window, determined not to show her nervousness. Then I suppose we should make sure we're ready. I've been thinking we should move some of the firewood even closer to the house, maybe stack it right on the porch. Already planned on it, James said with a slight smile. You're thinking like a Wyoming rancher now. The weather held for another week, cold but clear. James worked frantically to finish the last preparations, reinforcing the barn roof, checking all the outbuildings, making sure the cattle had access to the sheltered areas. Martha helped where she could, though James was constantly telling her not to overwork herself. I'm not made of glass, she'd snap at him. carrying another armload of wood. "I've worked hard my whole life, and I'm not about to stop now." "Stubborn woman," James would mutter, but there was affection in his voice that made Martha's heart skip. Pete and Tommy came by more frequently as the weather grew colder, helping with the heavy work and checking on the cattle in the outer pastures. One afternoon, Martha overheard them talking to James by the barn. "Storm's coming," Pete said, his weathered face serious. "I can feel it in my bones." "Big one, too. We should probably move the herd closer to the main barn while we still can." "How soon?" James asked. "Day or two, maybe 3 if we're lucky." "But it's coming, boss. I've lived here 40 years, and I know the signs." James nodded, his expression grim. "Then we'd better get moving." "Tommy, ride out to the Henderson place and let them know. They might want to check on their own stock." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd heard stories about Wyoming blizzards, about people getting lost between their house and barn, about livestock freezing to death in the fields. She pushed the fear down and focused on what she could control. She checked their supplies again, made sure the lamps were filled with oil, prepared extra food that could be eaten cold if necessary. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening with shocking suddenness. One moment the sky was merely gray and threatening, the next it was a solid wall of white. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, rattling the windows and finding every tiny crack in the walls. Snow didn't just fall, it flew horizontally, driven by winds so strong they bent the trees nearly double. James had barely made it back from securing the barn when the worst of it hit. He stumbled through the door, covered in snow, his face red from the cold and wind. Martha rushed to help him out of his frozen coat, her hands shaking slightly. "Pete and Tommy?" she asked. "Made it to the bunkhouse before it got bad," James assured her, pulling off his gloves with stiff fingers. "They've got food and heat. They'll be fine." That first night, the storm raged with a fury that frightened Martha more than she wanted to admit. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and snow. She'd built up the fire in the kitchen stove and the fireplace in the living room, trying to keep the warmth from escaping. James had helped her hang blankets over the windows and doorways to the unused rooms, concentrating the heat where they needed it most. They ate a simple dinner of soup and bread, neither of them particularly hungry, but knowing they needed to keep their strength up. The conversation was sparse, both of them listening to the storm's violence outside. "How long do these usually last?" Martha asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Could be a day, could be a week," James said honestly. "This one sounds bad. We might be snowed in for a while even after it stops." Martha nodded, absorbing this information. A week, possibly more. Just the two of them trapped in this house together. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead she felt something else. Something she didn't want to examine too closely. By midnight, the temperature inside the house had dropped noticeably, despite their best efforts. Martha had changed into her warmest nightgown and wrapped herself in a quilt, but she was still shivering. She'd gone to bed in her small room off the kitchen, but the cold had seeped through the walls until sleep was impossible. She found James in the living room, feeding more wood into the fireplace. He had changed into dry clothes, thick wool pants and a flannel shirt, and had draped a blanket over his shoulders. He looked up when she entered, concern crossing his face. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I'm cold," Martha admitted, pulling her quilt tighter around herself. "I think every bit of heat is getting sucked right out through the walls." James frowned, looking around the room. "Your room is on the outside wall. It'll be the coldest part of the house." He hesitated, then said, "You should sleep in here, closer to the fire. I'll take the chair. You can have the sofa." Martha looked at the worn sofa and the equally worn armchair. Neither looked particularly comfortable for sleeping, but they were both closer to the fire's warmth. "That doesn't seem fair. You've been working all day." "So have you," James pointed out. "Look, we're both adults. We can share a room without it being improper. The important thing is staying warm." They arranged themselves as modestly as possible. Martha took the sofa, piling it with every blanket and quilt she could find. James settled into the chair, which was really too small for his frame, his long legs stretched out awkwardly. The fire crackled between them, providing light and much-needed warmth. "Thank you," Martha said softly into the semi-darkness. "For everything. For giving me this job, for making me feel welcome, for being kind when you didn't have to be." "You've earned your place here 10 times over," James replied. "This ranch hasn't felt like a home in 3 years. You brought life back into it. I should be thanking you." They fell silent, listening to the storm rage outside. Despite the warmth of the fire, Martha could feel cold air seeping in around the windows. She pulled the blankets tighter, but couldn't stop shivering. The second day of the storm was somehow worse than the first. The wind, if possible, blew even harder and the temperature dropped further. James ventured out briefly to check on the animals, fighting his way to the barn through waist-deep snow. He came back half frozen, reporting that Pete and Tommy were fine, but that the snow was piling up at an alarming rate. "The thermometer outside the barn read 10 below zero," he said, warming his hands by the fire. "And that's before accounting for the wind. It's dangerous out there." They spent the day staying close to the fire, trying to conserve their energy and their warmth. Martha cooked simple meals on the stove, grateful they had a wood-burning model that didn't require electricity. They played cards to pass the time, talked about inconsequential things, and tried not to think about how long the storm might last. That second night was colder still. Martha lay on the sofa, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and still her teeth chattered. Across the room, she could hear James shifting in the chair, equally uncomfortable. The fire was burning low despite James adding wood every hour, as if the cold was simply too strong to be kept at bay. Around 2 a.m, Martha sat up, unable to bear it any longer. "James," she said quietly, "are you awake?" "Can't sleep in this cold," he admitted. "I'm sorry, Martha. I don't know what else to do. I've never had a storm hit this hard this early in the season." Martha made a decision then, one born of practicality but also of something deeper she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. "This is foolish," she said firmly. "We're both freezing to death in the same room because we're worried about propriety. We're 2 grown adults who've both been married. We know how to behave ourselves." James sat up straighter in his chair. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop being ridiculous and admit that shared warmth is better than separate cold," Martha said, her voice stronger now. "We can push the sofa closer to the fire and share the blankets. Body heat will keep us both warmer than trying to manage separately." "Martha, I don't want you to think," James began, but she cut him off. "I don't think anything except that we're both too old and too sensible to freeze for the sake of what the neighbors might say. And in case you haven't noticed, there are no neighbors around to say anything." James was quiet for a long moment. Martha could almost hear him thinking, wrestling with propriety and practicality. Finally, he stood up. "You're right. It's the sensible thing to do." They rearranged the furniture, pushing the sofa as close to the fireplace as was safe. Martha gathered all the blankets and quilts while James built up the fire. When they finally settled down, lying side by side with careful space between them, both wrapped in their own layers of clothing beneath the shared blankets, Martha felt warmer than she had in 2 days. "This is better," James said quietly, and she could hear relief in his voice. "Much better," Martha agreed, though her heart was beating fast for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. They lay in silence for a while, listening to the storm continue its assault on the house. Despite the space between them, Martha was acutely aware of James's presence, of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body toward hers. "Martha," James said suddenly, his voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever feel guilty? About being happy again, I mean, after losing someone?" Martha thought about the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I should still be grieving Thomas, like being content or finding joy again is somehow disrespectful to his memory. But then I remember that life is for the living. The dead wouldn't want us to stop living just because they're gone." "Elizabeth used to tell me that if anything happened to her, I shouldn't spend the rest of my life alone," James said softly. "She made me promise, actually, not long before she died." She said life was too precious to waste on loneliness, but promising is easier than actually doing it. "What scares you most about it?" Martha asked gently. James was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Forgetting her, moving on and having her fade away like she never mattered. And also," he paused, "also caring about someone new and losing them too. I don't know if I could survive that pain again." Martha understood completely because she felt the same way. "I think," she said slowly, "that we don't forget the people we loved. They become part of who we are. And caring about someone new doesn't erase them. It just means our hearts are bigger than we thought." "When did you get so wise?" James asked, and she could hear a smile in his voice. "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid all the time." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence now, the kind shared by 2 people who understood each other. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, wrapped in blankets and finally warm, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. As sleep finally began to claim her, she felt James's hand find hers beneath the blankets, his fingers intertwined with hers, warm and solid and real. Neither of them said anything, but neither of them pulled away either. They fell asleep like that, holding hands like teenagers, while the storm raged on outside and something new and fragile began to grow between them in the warmth of the firelight. The years that followed James and Martha's quiet wedding ceremony were not easy, but they were filled with a contentment that neither had expected to find again in their lifetime. The scandal that had erupted in town eventually faded, as all scandals do, replaced by newer gossip and fresher drama. But the couple at the Double R Ranch paid little attention to the whispers, too busy building a life together to worry about what others thought. Martha threw herself into making the ranch not just functional, but truly prosperous. She had a head for business that James had never possessed, and she convinced him to diversify their operations. They started raising chickens for eggs, which Martha sold in town every week. She planted a large vegetable garden and learned to preserve everything they grew, selling the surplus at the local market. Within 2 years, the ranch was making more money than it had in the previous 10. James, for his part, came alive in ways that surprised even himself. The weight of loneliness that had pressed down on him for so long lifted, and he found himself actually enjoying the work again rather than just enduring it. He taught Martha to ride, and she proved to be a natural horsewoman despite her age. On summer evenings, they'd ride out together to check the fences, talking about everything and nothing as the sun set over the Wyoming hills. Pete and Tommy remained loyal ranch hands, watching the transformation of their employer with quiet satisfaction. "Told you something was brewing," Pete would remind Tommy with a knowing grin. The two men became like family, joining James and Martha for Sunday dinners and celebrating holidays together when they had nowhere else to go. The real test came when James's children finally visited 6 months after the wedding. His daughter Caroline arrived first, driving up from Denver with her husband Robert and their 2 children. Martha had been nervous for weeks, cleaning the house until it sparkled and cooking enough food to feed twice as many people. She knew how important this meeting was, knew that James desperately wanted his daughter's approval even if he'd never say it out loud. Caroline was a tall, elegant woman in her early 30s who looked remarkably like the photographs Martha had seen of Elizabeth. She stepped out of the car and surveyed the ranch with a critical eye, her expression giving nothing away. Her children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, immediately ran toward the barn, excited by the horses in wide-open spaces. "Mrs. Rutledge," Caroline said coolly, extending her hand to Martha. The use of the formal name rather than calling her Martha felt like a small slap, but Martha took it in stride. "Please call me Martha. I'm so glad you could come. Your father has been looking forward to your visit." The first day was tense and awkward. Caroline watched Martha with suspicious eyes, clearly looking for signs that this woman was taking advantage of her grieving father. She made pointed comments about how different things looked, how her mother would have arranged things differently, how strange it was to see someone else in her mother's kitchen. James tried to smooth things over, but his efforts only seemed to make things worse. That evening, after the children had been put to bed in one of the upstairs rooms, Caroline confronted her father while Martha was in the kitchen cleaning up. "How could you replace Mother so quickly?" Caroline's voice carried through the house, sharp with pain and anger. "It's only been 3 years. 3 years, and you've already moved another woman into her home, into her life." Martha froze at the sink, her hands in the soapy water, torn between walking away to give them privacy and staying to hear what James would say. "I haven't replaced anyone," James said firmly, his voice steady. "Your mother will always be your mother, and I will always love her memory. But Caroline, I was drowning in loneliness. This house was killing me, slowly but surely. Martha didn't replace Elizabeth. She saved my life. You barely knew her before you married her. What kind of woman agrees to marry a man so quickly? She's obviously after your money." James's laugh was bitter. "Money? Caroline, this ranch barely turned a profit for the last 5 years. If Martha was after money, she'd pick the wrong man. She's worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and she's helped make this place successful again. She's earned everything she has." There was a long silence. Then Caroline's voice came again, quieter this time, but still cold. "I just don't understand how you could move on so easily." It was terrifying. Every day I felt guilty for being happy again, for laughing again, for wanting to wake up in the morning. But your mother told me before she died that she didn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone. She made me promise I'd try to find happiness again. I'm just trying to keep that promise." Martha heard footsteps and quickly returned to washing dishes, pretending she hadn't heard. When Caroline appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes were red from crying. "My father says you saved his life," Caroline said abruptly. Martha dried her hands on a towel, choosing her words carefully. "I think we saved each other. I was in a pretty dark place when I came here, too. Your father gave me a chance when I had nothing and no one. This ranch became my home, and he became my family." "Did you know my mother?" Caroline asked. "No, but I've heard wonderful things about her. Your father speaks of her often, with so much love and respect." I've never tried to take her place, Caroline. I couldn't if I wanted to. She was your mother, his first wife, and she built this ranch with him. I'm just grateful to have the chance to help continue what she started." Caroline studied Martha's face for a long moment, searching for dishonesty and finding none. "He does seem happier," she admitted reluctantly. "I haven't seen him smile like he did today in years. Not since before Mother got sick." "He's a good man," Martha said simply. "He deserves to be happy." The ice didn't thaw completely during that visit, but it cracked. By the time Caroline left, 3 days later, she hugged Martha goodbye, and though the embrace was brief and somewhat stiff, it was genuine. "Take care of him," she whispered. "I will," Martha promised. "And you're always welcome here. This is still your home, too." James's son David was harder to win over. He visited a year later, alone, and spent most of his time questioning the ranch's finances and Martha's role in managing them. He was suspicious and cold, clearly believing Martha was manipulating his elderly father. It took several visits over several years before David finally accepted that Martha genuinely cared for James and wasn't after the family inheritance. The ranch continued to thrive under their joint management. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market downturns, and unexpected expenses, always working together to find solutions. Martha proved to have an uncanny ability to stretch a dollar, while James's years of experience helped them avoid costly mistakes. They developed routines and traditions that were uniquely theirs. Every morning they had coffee together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the hills. Every evening they'd sit together by the fire, reading or talking, or simply enjoying each other's company. On their anniversary each year, they'd ride out to the spot where James had proposed, bringing a picnic lunch and spending the afternoon remembering how far they'd come. Martha became known in town not as the scandalous widow who'd trapped James Rutledge, but as a shrewd businesswoman and a pillar of the community. She organized fundraisers for the local school, helped struggling families with food from the ranch, and earned respect through her actions rather than her words. As they grew older together, their love deepened in ways that first love rarely does. They knew each other's rhythms, understood each other's silences, and could communicate with just a look across a crowded room. When James's arthritis made ranch work difficult, Martha was there to help. When Martha caught pneumonia one brutal winter, James barely left her side for 2 weeks, nursing her back to health with the same gentle care he'd shown when she'd twisted her ankle years before. They celebrated their 15th anniversary in 1967, and by then, even Caroline and David had come to genuinely love Martha as part of the family. The grandchildren called her Grandma Martha and begged to visit the ranch every summer. The scandal that had once consumed the town had been completely forgotten, replaced by respect and admiration for the couple who'd built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. James passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1975, at the age of 75. He'd spent the day before working in the barn despite Martha's protests, insisting he felt fine. They'd had dinner together, laughed about something Tommy had said, and gone to bed holding hands, as they always did. When Martha woke the next morning, he was gone, a peaceful expression on his face. The grief was crushing, but Martha had learned how to survive loss. She mourned deeply and honestly, surrounded by Caroline and David and their families, by Pete and Tommy who'd become like sons to her, by the community that had finally accepted her as one of their own. She continued running the ranch for 5 more years, refusing all suggestions that she sell and move to town. "This is my home," she'd say firmly. "James and I built this life together, and I'm not abandoning it just because he's not here physically. He's still here in every fence post he mended, every decision we made, every memory we created." At 84, Martha finally agreed to sell the ranch, but only to a young couple who reminded her of herself and James all those years ago. Hardworking, determined, and deeply in love. She moved to a small house in town, taking with her the most precious mementos of her life with James. The local newspaper interviewed her for their human interest column, wanting to hear about the remarkable woman who'd helped transform the Double R Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the county. The young reporter, fresh out of journalism school, asked about that first winter, about the storm that had brought her and James together. Martha's eyes sparkled with memory and mischief. "People made such a fuss about propriety and scandal," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "But we were 2 people who'd both lost everything, who'd both learned the hard way that life is too short and too precious to waste on fear. That storm forced us to be honest about what we felt, to stop hiding behind grief and propriety and worry about what others might think." "Do you have any regrets?" the reporter asked. Martha thought about this seriously. "Only that we didn't have more time together. 23 years sounds like a lot, but it wasn't nearly enough. I'd give anything for one more morning coffee on the porch, one more evening by the fire, One more chance to hold his hand and tell him I loved him. What would you say to people facing similar situations? People who are afraid to love again after loss? Martha smiled, and for a moment the reporter could see the fierce, determined woman she must have been all those years ago. I'd tell them what I learned that night during the storm, when I finally had the courage to stop being afraid. Life is for the living. The people we've loved and lost wouldn't want us to freeze. Not from the cold, and not from fear. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to let go of your pride and your fear before you can find warmth again. And that warmth, that second chance at happiness, is worth every bit of courage it takes to reach for it. Martha Henley, Rutledge, passed away quietly in her sleep 6 months after that interview, at the age of 89. She was buried beside James under a headstone that read exactly what she'd requested: 2 lonely souls who dared to choose life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people: Caroline and David with their families, former ranch hands, townspeople who'd known her for decades, and even some who'd once participated in the scandal and gossip surrounding her marriage. At the reception afterward, Caroline stood and raised her glass. "My father used to say that Martha saved his life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think they saved each other. They showed all of us that it's never too late for happiness, never too late to be brave, never too late to choose life over fear. The greatest gift they gave us wasn't the successful ranch or the family memories. It was the example of their courage." The story of Martha and James became something of a legend in the small Wyoming community. Young people hearing it for the first time would be amazed that such a romance had happened right there in their ordinary town. Older residents would smile and nod, remembering the scandal that had once seemed so important and realizing how small and petty it all seemed now. Years later, the couple who'd bought the Double R Ranch found a box in the attic filled with letters James and Martha had written to each other over the years. They'd never mailed them, just written their thoughts and feelings and saved them as private treasures. The letters revealed the depth of their love, their struggles with guilt and fear, their gratitude for finding each other, and their determination to make every day count. One letter written by Martha on their 10th anniversary summed up their entire story. "Some people get one great love in their lifetime. We were blessed enough to get 2. Our first loves taught us how to love. Our second love taught us that the human heart is more resilient and more capable than we ever imagined. We built something beautiful from broken pieces, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it, not even the storms that brought us together."